Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're looking into a really pivotal figure, Franklin Pierce. He was the 14th president, serving from 1853 to 1857.
Right, and it's a fascinating time, actually. On the surface, things seemed kind of calm after the Compromise of 1850.
Seems calm, yeah.
But underneath, well, the tension between North and South over slavery was just simmering, really heating up.
And that's the core tension with Pierce, isn't it? He's this New England guy.
Exactly. From New Hampshire.
But his presidency seems geared towards, keeping the South happy. It's a real paradox.
It is, and many argue now that his policies, maybe unintentionally actually, sped up the breakdown of the Union, pushed things toward conflict.
So for this deep dive, we're drawing on a couple of key sources. The White House Historical Association gives a good overview, and then we've got the detailed picture from Wikipedia.
Yep, combining those should give us a pretty solid look.
Yeah. Our mission, then, is to really unpack the key events of his presidency and try to understand why it's seen as such a critical and honestly controversial time in U.S. history.
Okay, so where should we start? His background.
Sounds good. Franklin Pierce, born 1804, Hillsborough, New Hampshire. His father, Benjamin, he was quite the figure himself.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, Revolutionary War lieutenant, state legislator, farmer, even ran a tavern. So, service and community roots were definitely there.
Right, that classic New England background. And he did well academically.
He did. Graduated 5th in his class at Bowdoin College. Then, like a lot of ambitious guys back then, he went into law. Got admitted to the bar in New Hampshire.
And politics followed pretty quickly after that.
Very quickly. New Hampshire legislature in 29, speaker by 31. Then off to D.C., House of Representatives 33 to 37, then the Senate 37 to 42. A really fast climb.
It really was. But his personal life, that seems like a whole different story running alongside his public career. He married Jane Means Appleton in 1834. Yes, and they were, well, quite different. She was apparently quite reserved, very religious, and really disliked politics. Hated Washington, D.C.
That must have created some tension.
Oh, definitely. A lot of strain, by all accounts, especially with his career path.
And the personal tragedies they faced were just immense.
Unimaginable, really. All three of their sons died young. The last one, Benjamin, died in a horrific train accident just weeks before Pierce was inaugurated.
Right before he took office. I mean, how do you even process that level of grief while stepping into the presidency?
It's hard to fathom. That loss, it just cast a huge shadow over everything, affected both him and Jane profoundly. It's probably why, some say, he chose to affirm his oath on a law book instead of a Bible, a reflection of that immense sorrow, perhaps.
So with that personal tragedy hanging over him, how did this guy, who wasn't exactly a household name, even get the top job? Let's talk about that path to the presidency.
Right, so 1852, the Democratic Convention. Pierce was a total dark horse. Nobody really expected him to win.
Really? Who were the front runners?
Oh, you had figures like Lewis Cass, James Buchanan, Stephen Douglas, the big names. But the convention deadlocked, ballot after ballot.
How many?
48 ballots with no winner. Then, on the 49th, they finally turned to Pierce as a compromise candidate. Someone, maybe everyone could just about agree on.
Wow. 49 ballots. That really shows how split the party was, even then. What was it about his platform that finally united them?
The big thing was ironclad support for the Compromise of 1850. And crucially, a promise. No federal interference with slavery. Period.
So that appealed strongly to the South.
Absolutely. But his northern roots gave him some appeal there, too. He seemed like maybe, just maybe, he could bridge that gap.
And he faced the Whig candidate, General Winfield Scott, in the election.
Correct. Pierce won, and while the popular vote wasn't a landslide, the Electoral College victory was huge.
How did he pull that off?
Well, he managed to get Democrats from both North and South, plus his fellow New Englanders, and even some Southern Whigs who were maybe looking for a change. It looked like he might actually be able to hold things together.
But that initial promise, that hope for unity, it didn't last long, did it? Let's get into his domestic policies and the political fights that started almost immediately.
Yeah, he tried. He appointed a cabinet with people from different party factions, trying to balance things out.
The hard shells and soft shells.
Exactly. Those were the main factions, basically differing on how much the government should or shouldn't get involved with slavery issues. But the divisions were just too deep. He couldn't really bridge that gap effectively.
And he had other setbacks early on, too. Didn't his vice president die?
Yes, William R. King died just about a month after taking office. And back then, there was no constitutional way to replace a VP.
So for most of his term, there was no vice president.
Right. The president pro tempore of the Senate was next in line. It just added to the sense of instability, perhaps.
It really sounds like he was dealt a tough hand from the start. Did he manage any significant domestic policy wins? Anything concrete?
Well, his administration did try some civil service reforms. They pushed for more accountability in places like the Treasury and Interior departments, introduced some early versions of competency exams for jobs.
Interesting. A move towards professionalism, maybe?
Sort of a precursor to later, bigger reforms.
Yeah. And he got a Supreme Court appointment through.
He did. John Archibald Campbell, a known states' rights advocate.
Which, again, seems to fit that pattern of appeasing Southern interests.
It does seem consistent with that broader approach, yeah.
Okay, let's shift to the economy, what was happening there. And infrastructure, the railroad talk was heating up, right?
Yeah, his Treasury Secretary, James Guthrie, he focused on reforming the Treasury, trying to get government money back from private banks. More accountability, more transparency was the goal.
And the Transcontinental Railroad. Huge project, lots of debate about the route.
A very big deal. And his Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis?
Later president of the Confederacy.
The very same. Davis strongly pushed for a southern route for the railroad. He oversaw surveys for potential routes. He also managed construction projects in D.C., like work on the Capitol Dome and the Washington Monument.
And the Gadsden Purchase fits into this, buying that land from Mexico.
Absolutely. A key motivation for the Gadsden Purchase was getting that specific land needed for a viable southern railroad route.
So again, even infrastructure projects are getting tied up in these sectional interests.
Very much so. This push for expansion, especially in ways that clearly benefited the South, just highlights that central contradiction we talked about. Northern guy, southern-leaning policies.
Okay, let's look outwards now. Foreign policy. What were the goals there? Expansionism seems to have been in the air.
Definitely. Pierce was aligned with the Young America movement. They were all about expansion. His Secretary of State, William Marcy, even had this slightly odd push for American diplomats to wear simpler clothes than Europeans.
Trying to project a distinct American identity.
Yeah, a sort of symbolic break from old world ways, I suppose.
Did they achieve anything significant on the trade front?
They did, actually.
Yeah.
Important trade deals were signed. One with Great Britain regarding Canada, and another really significant one with Japan, following Commodore Perry's famous visit, opening up trade.
But foreign policy wasn't all smooth sailing. There was the Ostend Manifesto controversy. That sounds ominous.
It was very controversial.
Yeah.
Essentially, some American diplomats in Europe drafted this document suggesting the U.S. should try to buy Cuba from Spain.
Okay.
And if Spain refused, the manifesto hinted maybe forcefully taking it wouldn't be out of the question.
Whoa, and the reaction.
Huge backlash in the North. They saw it as a blatant plot to grab more territory for slavery, to expand the power of the slave states.
So even foreign policy gets sucked into the slavery vortex.
Absolutely. It just kept showing how that single issue was overshadowing almost everything else. Balancing national ambition with this deep internal division was proving impossible.
Which brings us inevitably to the absolute centerpiece of his presidency, the thing he's most remembered for, the Kansas-Nebraska Act and Bleeding Kansas.
Yes. You really can't understand Pierce's presidency without understanding this. The act was pushed by Senator Stephen Douglas, the stated goal: organize the Kansas and Nebraska territories.
To allow for settlement and, importantly, that transcontinental railroad, right?
Exactly. Facilitate the railroad, likely starting from Chicago, Douglas's home state. But the mechanism for organizing the territories was the explosive part: popular sovereignty.
Popular sovereignty, meaning the settlers in each territory would vote on whether to allow slavery or not.
Precisely.
It sounds democratic, maybe, letting the people decide. But what did it actually do?
Well, crucially, it blew up the Missouri Compromise of 1820. That compromise had banned slavery in those northern territories for over 30 years.
So this act just wiped that away.
Wiped it away. It opened up huge areas to the possibility of slavery where it had been prohibited. And that just ignited a firestorm. It proved compromise wasn't working anymore.
And Pierce, he knew how explosive this was, especially in the North. Why did he back it?
It seems his main drivers were, one, trying to keep the Democratic Party from splintering completely, and two, he was heavily influenced by Southern advisors in his cabinet, like Jefferson Davis. He probably genuinely thought this was the way to finally settle the slavery question and keep the Union together.
But the outcome was the opposite.
Completely the opposite. You had this immediate rush of pro-slavery people, mostly from Missouri, and anti-slavery settlers, often funded by abolitionist groups in the East, pouring into Kansas.
Both sides trying to win the territory for their cause.
Exactly, and it led directly to violence, voter fraud, intimidation, Basically a mini Civil War right there on the plains. That's why they called it Bleeding Kansas.
How did the Pierce administration handle the chaos?
Not well from the perspective of fairness or calming things down. They officially recognized the pro-slavery legislature, even though its election was highly questionable due to Missourians crossing the border to vote illegally.
So they sided with the pro-slavery faction.
Pretty clearly, yes. They even used federal troops against the anti-slavery or free state settlers at times. It looked very partisan.
And this wasn't just happening out west. The slavery issue was causing conflict back east too, right? The Anthony Burns case.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Anthony Burns was an escaped slave living in Boston. When his former owner tried to reclaim him under the Fugitive Slave Act, there was massive public protest in Boston.
A very anti-slavery city.
Extremely. But Pierce was determined to enforce the federal law. He sent federal troops to Boston to ensure Burns was returned to slavery in Virginia.
The image of federal troops marching a man back into slavery through the streets of Boston.
It was incredibly powerful and deeply alienated many Northerners. It just cemented this view of Pierce as being completely in the pocket of the Southern slave power, as they called it.
So it seems pretty clear these events, Kansas-Nebraska, Bleeding Kansas, the Burns case, they must have tanked his popularity, especially up north.
Oh, absolutely devastated it. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, in particular, is often seen as the single event that really shattered any remaining national unity.
And it led to shifts in the political landscape.
Huge shifts. The Whig Party basically collapsed over the issue, and two new major forces emerged. The Republican Party, founded specifically to oppose the expansion of slavery into the territories.
Right, that became Lincoln's party.
Exactly. And also the Know Nothing movement, which was more focused on anti-immigrant and anti-Catholic sentiment, but also drew support from people disillusioned with the old parties.
Yet, despite all this chaos and his plummeting popularity, Pierce actually thought he'd get renominated in 1856.
It seems that way, yes. Which, looking back, feels pretty out of touch.
A bit optimistic.
You could say that. He likely still believed his policies were the only way to save the Union, even if they're unpopular in the North. But the Democratic Party leaders, they saw the writing on the wall.
They knew he couldn't win.
They knew he was too damaged politically, especially in the crucial northern states. So they strategically bypassed him and nominated James Buchanan instead.
Ouch. How did Pierce take that?
He wasn't happy. In his last message to Congress, he didn't back down at all. He defended his actions, blamed the country's problems on Republicans and abolitionists. No real sign of regret or second-guessing.
So a rather defiant end to his term. What happened to him after leaving the White House?
The country is heading towards war.
He went back home to New Hampshire. He traveled a bit, but mostly stayed out of the direct political fray, though he did comment on things.
And his stance during the Civil War.
He opposed the war. He was critical of Lincoln's actions, particularly things like suspending habeas corpus. He saw them as unconstitutional overreaches.
That couldn't have gone over well in the North during wartime.
Not at all. He faced accusations of being disloyal, a copperhead. He actually had to publicly defend himself against those charges.
And his reaction to Lincoln's assassination. Reports suggest he was privately saddened, but he didn't make much of a public show of mourning, which again, in that climate of national grief, didn't help his reputation in the North.
It sounds like his later years were difficult personally, too, not just politically.
They were. His wife Jane passed away. His close friend, the author Nathaniel Hawthorne, also died. He struggled with alcohol, became more withdrawn.
A sad end. Did he find any solace?
He seemed to turn more towards religion later in life. He was baptized into the Episcopal Church.
And politically, any final acts or stances?
Interestingly, after the war, he supported Andrew Johnson's approach to Reconstruction, perhaps seeing it as the quickest way to bring the southern states back and restore the old Union he'd tried, in his way, to preserve.
He died in 1869.
Yes, in Concord, New Hampshire. The official cause was cirrhosis of the liver, likely related to his struggles with alcohol.
So, when historians look back now, what's the general consensus on the Pierce presidency? How is he ranked?
Overwhelmingly, the assessment is negative. He consistently ranks near the bottom in surveys of presidential effectiveness, sometimes considered one of the worst.
Why such a harsh judgment?
Primarily because his actions, especially signing the Kansas-Nebraska Act, are seen as pouring gasoline on the fire of sectional conflict. Instead of calming things, he's viewed as having actively worsened the crisis and made the Civil War more likely, perhaps even inevitable.
Is that the only view? Are there any historians who offer a different take?
There are some nuances. Some argue he was perhaps a well-intentioned nationalist caught in an impossible situation. that maybe no one could have prevented the war by the 1850s.
That the forces were just too strong.
Possibly. And some point to his administration's successes, like those trade deals with Britain and Japan, as things that get overlooked because of the slavery issue. But the dominant view remains that his handling of Kansas-Nebraska was a catastrophic failure of leadership.
It really does seem his legacy is a stark warning about leadership during times of deep, deep division.
It really is. Yeah. It forces you to think about that incredibly difficult balance between compromise, which he seemed to pursue relentlessly with the South, and holding firm on core principles, which many felt he failed to do regarding the spread of slavery.
So as we wrap up this deep dive on Franklin Pierce, we're definitely left with a sense of complexity, but also undeniable tragedy, both personal and political.
Absolutely.
It leaves you with that big question. Considering everything he was up against, the personal grief, the political cauldron, was there any different path he could have taken? Anything that might have maybe slowed the slide towards war?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Could refusing to sign Kansas-Nebraska have worked? Would taking a stronger stand against slavery's expansion, even at the cost of party unity, have led somewhere different? Or was the die already cast?
Hard to say for sure.
Very hard. Historians still debate it. Did he make the crisis worse, or was he just swept along by currents too strong to resist?
It definitely makes you reflect on leadership today, doesn't it? That tightrope walk between finding common ground and standing firm on what you believe is right, especially when the country feels so divided. Pierce's story is, if nothing else, a powerful, maybe cautionary tale.
A very cautionary tale indeed. Thanks for exploring this tough chapter with me.